Greetings, people of Earth. My name's Jax. There's Jules. She's exhausted. Today, I wanted to talk about what makes somebody wise and what is wisdom and why do we admire this trait? How do we identify it in the books we read, the films and television we watch, all of that kind of stuff in between. If you've been here a while, you know that wisdom is something that is so interesting to me, and this idea of having this long-term perspective and this knowledge plus experience. And that's my definition of wisdom. It's this understanding of life and how it moves, and understanding that we don't have as much control as we want. And so that's what we're talking about today. So I think I first want to talk about characters in media that we recognize as wise. These characters have wisdom, they pass it on. Oftentimes these characters are in the roles of like mentor figures, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Gandalf, Dumbledore, Master Oogway from Kung Fu Panda. These characters have a lot of lived experience. They're typically older. You very rarely get like a wise sage kind of character who is in their 20s or in their 30s. Like, these characters are usually like 80 or 1,000 or whatever it is. And I think that really comes into the whole play of like experience plus knowledge. And I talk about this a lot, and I'm very fascinated in trying to accumulate wisdom and trying to be able to understand that we have no control in life, and yet we can still manipulate and enhance and change our experiences based on our knowledge and how we think a situation might play out or how we interact with the world. So these elder characters, these characters who have been through wars and difficulties and struggles and strife and just life in general, they tend to pass these things on, and these things aren't recognized in the moment. I think a lot of the characters who are being mentored and a lot of the people like us who are being mentored by these older people don't appreciate this knowledge until we no longer have access to it, and we just have to remember vaguely what was said, or the ideas, or even just the vibe, even just the notions and the kind of personal interactions and characteristics that we associate. I think my first real experience with someone who is wise was probably my grandparents, and that might be the same for you guys, hopefully, if your grandparents, lived long enough to get to meet you and get to know you. But both of my sets of grandparents, one set is still here, one set is gone, but they both lived well into when I was like 25, 26 years old. And I remember just having conversations with them and their experiences being so interesting and fascinating to me, the ideas and the notions that they had. My father's mother, my grandmother, my gran, in particular, just had this kind of old world wisdom and knowledge. She was from England. Both sets of grandparents are English, but she had this kind of folkloric wisdom and way about her where she would just sort of smile and kind of nod at a situation, or she'd meet a couple for the first time and she'd know instantly if they were gonna make it or break up. And she could tell you all about like plants and herbs and flowers and all kinds of like very niche subjects. And I think that also comes into wisdom, where you have these niche fields of expertise and this niche understanding of things. And there's also something that connects much deeper into the realm of maybe mysticism or spirituality or something. And I think we associate a lot of those wisdom figures, Dumbledore, Gandalf, these old wizards, with this understanding of times gone by, and maybe not the greatest understanding of the way the world is going. But at the end of the day, I think these people understood that society is society. It doesn't really change. And although we can have new technology and new things that are interesting or hard to understand, these people still fundamentally know the world they're in, and they know the way people react to situations. They've been around long enough. They have the experience and the knowledge to see where things are going. They can see the writing on the wall, where the rest of us are just going, oh, this new AI stuff's great. and they're going, I remember the Cold War. I remember this. I remember World War II. I remember XYZ. And I think part of this mystique of wisdom, this idea, this aura, this powerful energy you get around people who are very wise, is the idea that they have survived so much. They have lived through world events. I'm always fascinated to ask older people where they were when President Kennedy was assassinated, or where they were at this specific event. My one grandfather survived the Blitz in London as a boy, and the stories he would tell us of life during the Blitz in London, where you had incredible tragedies happening every single day, and a neighborhood that you walked through one day would be leveled the next day, and hiding under a shelter with your grandparents of an even older generation. Those kinds of stories always fascinated me so much, because surviving those events ties you in with them. My grandfather was too young to be a veteran of World War II, but in a way, he still survived so much of the devastation, the rationing, the difficulties, whether or not, the British and the Allies would become victorious. And so it places them in this space in my head that's very high up, that has a lot of esteem and prestige, and even just the hardships that they went through, and I think that creates this aura of wisdom in these characters that we watch. We are often told very, very loosely some of the things they did. Gandalf is supposed to be like 1,000 years old. Dumbledore has gone through difficulties and struggles in his life, and we're never really explicitly told in detail what these things are, but we're just told they were really big, they were really intense, and you should have some respect for these people. Speaking of respect, I think this is another thing where wisdom really comes into play, is that wisdom doesn't necessarily scream or demand respect, but it's just kind of initiated. You just give respect to someone who is wise, the village elder, or the cunning folk, or the people who seem to have this knowledge that goes back far longer, and they seem to be far more connected to the area they grew up in, the land, or the history, or the culture, or the language. And those kinds of things, for a young person who is trying to figure out their place in the world, trying to figure out their journey or their path or their goals, those kinds of things are very nuanced and very difficult to deal with as a young person. And so we look at these elders and these people who are generators of wisdom with this idea that, man, they know where they're going, they know what they have. And so that kind of focus is really interesting, and I think it's why we have this idea of wisdom and generate these concepts around it, if you know what I mean. Fun activity for the comments. Please let me know who is your mentor, who is your wisdom creator, who is the person that you look up to. Maybe it was a grandparent, maybe it's someone in fiction, maybe it's a Sherlock Holmes type of figure, or a heroic sort of wise sage, because I think it does say a lot about you in terms of what you value and what you admire. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is that these people we associate with wisdom and knowledge often have made mistakes. If you're familiar with the Harry Potter series, you know that Dumbledore made several mistakes throughout his whole journey, his whole story with Harry. And I think that is another way that we can admire and gain wisdom from these people, is that inherently, if you're going to live on this planet, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to run into problems. You're going to really screw stuff up. And that is okay, as long as you react, or you attempt to make amends, you attempt to make it better. And I think that's another great lesson that these wise people teach you, is that mistakes absolutely happen. My grandparents all made critical mistakes in various parts of their lives, and they didn't let those mistakes define who they were. They learned as much as they possibly could from those mistakes, and they moved on and they grew from it. And just like we do, we make mistakes and we often beat ourselves up for it. We get anxious and we are filled with dread and anxiety about the problems, and we want to go back in time and fix them. And yet that is not the option. That is not the ability of humans. And so you are forced to just move forward and take what you can from the situation. So I think that is all I want to say on what is wisdom and how do you become wise for now. There will obviously be another video very soon, but thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comments, person who generated wisdom in you. And I hope you're having a beautiful day. And as always, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.